There is a kind of allegory, but before that, there's a riddle to be solved. Mullah Nasruddin gave a young boy a ceramic jug and told him to go to the well and fill it up with water. And then he gave him a big clout under the ear and he said, make sure you don't drop and break it. Well, a passerby saw this and said, Mullah, why are you striking him when he hasn't broken anything? And the Mullah retorted, well, what good would it do to clout him after he broke the vessel? And then there's that story that's been told before of the Zen practitioner who'd been in the monastery for many, many years. And he had an inspiration in his meditations that it was time to go out into the world. So he went to his Zen master and bowing before him, making the necessary salutations, he said this to his master, that he felt that it was time to go out and put into practice all those things that he'd learned while he was in the monastery after all of these years. And the master nodded his head and then told him to go. So the practitioner left and went off to his little cell to gather his spare robes and put them in a kerchief to take with him. And then he went back to the meditation hall where the master was sitting to make his final farewells and thank yous and salutations to him. But as soon as the Zen practitioner went in and knelt before the master took his staff and gave him a good beating. Well, the practitioner got up in a state of absolute confusion. What did this beating mean? What does it mean? Does it mean that he's not worthy to go out? Was it that he shouldn't be going? So when he went out of the meditation hall and he met the head monk, he told them, the head monk, what had happened, and he asked, what did the master mean? Does it mean that I can't go, that I'm not worthy of depart? The head monk said, wait, I'll go and ask the master. So the head monk went into the master and said, Master, what was the meaning of your beating our practitioner who wants to depart? Does that mean that he's not to leave us? And the master said, oh, no, he's got to go. But when he comes back, he's going to be enlightened, and this is the last chance I had to give him a good thrashing. So these two stories constitute a riddle for us. I wonder what it could mean for us if we recognize that this vessel, this ewer, this jug, is synonymous with enlightenment. But we'll leave that for the moment and maybe let it chunk away in our heart of hearts for a while. And the kind of allegory is a story about a couple, and they were very poor. They had many children who they found very difficult to even earn the subsistence to keep their children fed. So it was decided that the husband would leave the family home and go and seek employment elsewhere where he could perhaps earn enough to keep his family. Well, the husband and father traveled far and wide, and he worked wherever he could find work. And in the process of doing so, after some long while, some many years, he managed to have accumulated a bag full of coppers, a bag full of silver, and a bag full of gold. Well, having these 3 bags now in his possession, he decided that this was sufficient wealth to keep his family and that it was time to return. But on the road back towards his home village, he came across a fete, a fair, and he thought to himself, perhaps this is a good opportunity for me to buy a gift for my beloved wife. So he went into the fair and he went round to each of the vendors, but he couldn't find anything that seemed to be a suitable gift for her, until he came across an old woman sitting alone in a small cul-de-sac of the fair grounds, and she was holding an exquisite shawl. And when he caught sight of the shawl, he thought, now this would be a beautiful gift for my wife. So he went over to the old woman and he said to her, how much do you want for your shawl? Oh, she said, it's not for sale. And he said, well, what is it that you do sell? And she said, oh, I sell that which very few men are willing to pay for. Oh, what's that? He said. Then she replied, I sell wisdom. Oh, he said, well, how much would you want for some wisdom? And he said, oh, she said, oh, a bag of copper. So he handed over his bag of coppers and waited for her to impart wisdom. But she merely said to him, when you come to a crossroads, take the straight and long road, not the shorter. Well, he thought to himself, this is not wisdom. So he asked her, this is not wisdom? Oh, she said, to you, this is wisdom. Heed it well. But you know, his interest was really piqued by this. And he thought to himself, and then he said to her, well, what wisdom would you give me for a bag of silver? And she said, oh, well, when you see something that is seen to be ugly, know that it is beautiful. Well, this wisdom, well, this was something a little bit more like wisdom, but hardly wisdom as one would call it. But somehow he just couldn't help himself. He said, what would you give me for a bag of gold? And she merely said, sleep on your anger. Well, he was a little bit disgusted by this, and he turned to walk away, not knowing whether to cry at his loss and stupidity or be angry. But when he turned back, the old woman was gone. But there, where she had sat, was the shawl and a loaf of bread. He asked the vendors around, where is the old woman? Old woman? There was no old woman here, said any of the vendors. So the man, scratching his head, thought, well, at least I can take the shawl and the bread. So he bent down to lift the shawl, and it was much heavier than a shawl could be. And when he opened it, there was his bag of coppers, his bag of silver, and his bag of gold. So, taking these with him and walking down the road and rejoicing in the fact that his hard-earned money was still with him. But after some time, of course, it was hot, he got tired, so he sat under a tree and began to eat the loaf of bread that had been left behind, when several carriages carrying merchants came by, and they stopped seeing him as a traveller and very kindly invited him to ride in one of the carriages. But as they drove along, the carriages came to a crossroads, and there was an argument between the members who were riding in the carriages as to which way they should go. But suddenly the traveller remembered the shawl that was actually he held in his lap, and this wisdom had said, take the straight long road. So he said this very forcefully to those who travelled with him, and some of them decided that they would do what he said, and the others decided they would take the other carriage and take the shorter route. Well, having taken the straight and long road, they arrived at the town that was their destination, to find that the other carriage, which had taken the shorter route, had not arrived. So there was speculation as to what had happened. Maybe a wheel broke off the carriage or some such thing, but they decided to go and see if they could find them. But as they did come upon the carriage, which had been beset by robbers. And when the robbers saw the other carriage approaching, they immediately ran away. Well, of course, those who were in that carriage were very grateful for the advice that was given, so they took up gold coins, which they gave to our traveller as thanks and in payment. So our traveller went on his way, and it so happened that he came to a strange city, a walled city. But when he entered the walls of that city, he found that the place was in anarchy. People were looting the shops, there was mayhem going on. And then, when he entered the palace gates, which unusually were opened and people were milling around, and there were a group standing around, obviously jeering at something. And when our traveller approached, they found that it was what appeared to be a grotesque creature wearing royal robes, but with a misshapen head and warts and scales all over its body. And there were those around who would jeer, you're supposed to be a king and you're nothing that anyone would want to bow down to. And then, as our traveller shifted the weight of his knapsack on his back, he remembered the shawl, and he shouted, "You are beautiful, as all of God's creation is beautiful." And in that moment, the grotesque creature was transformed into a stately and nobly visaged king, who then stated that he'd been demonized, bewitched by an evil sorcerer, a spell which could only be broken when he was said to be beautiful. Of course, our traveller was rewarded with gold and jewels, and he went on his way and finally reached the outskirts of his hometown. But it was dusk and night, and he didn't want to frighten his dear wife, so he went to a nearby inn. But when he entered the inn, The one who greeted him, the servant of the inn, was none other than his wife, who looked at him, but obviously did not recognize him. He was angry. I've worked all of these years for the sake of my wife, and she doesn't even recognize me. He was angry. He decided then and there that he was going to take all his baggage and his gold and go somewhere else. But then, as he was getting together his goods, he saw the shore and remembered the saying. So he decided to sleep on his anger. The next morning, as he gathered up his goods, the woman who had greeted him approached him and said, "Forgive me for staring at you last evening, but you reminded me of someone." And he asked, "Who?" And she said, "My beloved husband, who left these long 18 years ago, and who I presume to be dead. You resemble him, and I loved him so." With tears in his eyes, our traveller took the exquisite shawl and wrapped it around her shoulders and enfolded her in an embrace, saying, "Oh, my beloved wife." An allegory, always an allegory. All allegories speak of spiritual journeying and the experiences we have. But back to the riddle. What is the meaning? What is the answer that arises for you out of these two simple stories? What's our experience? There's another little story that might give us the answer. It's this Sufi story about a young being who was seeking truth, which I guess is another name for enlightenment. And he traveled very far and had many, many experiences before making his way to the abode of the great Sufi Saint Al-Ghazali. When he entered the abode of Al-Ghazali and approached him, knelt down before him, Al-Ghazali looked with what seemed to be great anger at this young man and said, "Get out! Get out!" The young man was shocked and shattered, and stumbling, he left the Sufi saint's abode. Al-Ghazali's followers were aghast at this treatment. They knew the story of this young man. They knew what hardships he'd gone through to even come into the presence of this great master. And they said, how could you treat this seeker in this way? Al-Ghazali said, wait a moment. Just then a bird flew in the window, and bashing itself against the panes, trying to escape. It alit somewhere near Ghazali, perhaps on the table nearby, and Ghazali clapped his hands. The bird, with great fright, flew straight out into freedom. When he turned to his followers, Al-Ghazali said, don't you think that that bird was greatly shocked by the clapping of my hands? When we put these three stories together, we answer our riddle and also come to a very great realization for ourselves as to what it is that's occurred for us as that which brought us through the doorway, the gateless gate as we know it to be in Zen terms, to what would be said to be freedom, liberation. What do these stories mean? How do they bring us to a place where we can and must acknowledge that we are liberated, we are free? And begin to fly.